Thank you, Dr. Dudas. I, for a while, struggled to find what topic I was going to present today. I know most chiefs present something with brevity, with something light, music or food or their upbringing. Um, when I get into the talk, I'll explain why I picked this, but I think it's an important topic for me. I have some background in my undergraduate studies and personal interest in this. So I don't have any particular disclosures other than I'm not trying to scare you, but this might be alarming to some of you. I'm just simply laying out the facts of this problem. I may be dressed like a history professor today, but I'm not a military or nuclear expert, more of an armchair historian. And my background on this is from a very Western-centric point of view. I don't speak Russian or Chinese. I've never traveled to the nations, and I accept that I have many blind spots in how these countries might view this topic and view this problem. I started thinking about this more at the East meetings and during some of the meetings with the visiting Special Forces medics. This topic continually is being brought up at these meetings in podium discussions about the possibility of a near-peer conflict in the coming years. And that's code word for direct war with China and Russia. And absent of all these discussions has always been, they talk about soldiers and potential casualties, but it always has left out what I think is most important part is this escalation of tensions that could lead to a disaster. I don't recommend bringing this up on a first date. I don't recommend bringing this up at a Christmas party, but I think it's important as doctors that we talk and think about this problem because it is a global health issue, and it is, as I go into trauma training, an issue of injury prevention. What we'll do is we'll talk about the history of the development of the bomb, the scale of the threat, some of the medical impacts and health consequences that we've learned about from Japan and from other civil disasters, and basically some history of physician activists and prevention who have taken on this cause. My background from my family kind of led me to be interested in this topic from the beginning. This is my grandfather, Greg Mamikunian. He was born in Kurdistan in Iraq and immigrated to the US at age 17. He enrolled in medical school at Tulane, but dropped out after his first year when he had my dad, who's holding here, couldn't afford the tuition bill. He went on to get a PhD in biochemistry and worked for NASA and JPL, and was one of the first to investigate the effects of space on the human body in the Gemini and Apollo missions. And he also researched meteorites looking for the origins of life potentially being seeded from outer space and coming here. He says man will soon set his footprints on the moon, and then he will look with awe and admiration at the challenges and the course that lies ahead, the planets. To carry our feuds and plant them and propagate on other planetary bodies would be foolhardy and hardly befits a nation of enlightened cultures. We must begin today, or perhaps yesterday, to communicate our findings, as have been done in the past, in regards to the singular objective of well-being, irrespective of country or creed. The sacrifices in human and material resources will be comparatively insignificant if we abolish our prejudices and fears while pursuing an intimate and realistic policy, both East and West, and gaining a foothold on the planets. This was about 1 year before Apollo 11. While he was looking into the final frontier, my other grandparents were going to the last frontier. This is Dr. Gloria Park and her husband Orlo Park. They moved to the Alaska Territory before it was a state. She was an orphan from from Eastern Washington, and ended up a career physician in the Indian Health Service, serving the villages of Alaska, and was instrumental in the development of basically the medical system in the state. My grandfather, he didn't talk about it much, but he served in the Pacific in World War II, and then got the GI Bill, became an engineer for the Air Force afterwards. And he was active in the Cold War developments in Alaska. He helped design and run the jet fuel refinery in the state. Growing up in Alaska is a special place. You know, you might find yourself on an ice float or an iceberg or inside a carved out glacier. This is my world record or my all-time record, 7 minutes from the hook to the grill for a sockeye salmon. And my mom and dad raised me in a cabin that they built themselves, which we lived in until I was about 6 or 7 years old. Special to me, and it's been noted to be special by a lot of people. This is Brigadier General Billy Mitchell. He addressed Congress in 1935 when he was the head of the Army Air Guard. It was basically the predecessor to the Air Force. And he said that, I believe in the future, whoever holds Alaska will hold the world. It is the most important strategic place in the world. And this is the base that my grandfather worked at J-Bear. It shows the distance between Alaska and all the capitals of nations that we had tensions with over the years. I like to imagine an alternative reality where Alaska was not purchased from Russia, and that's been a very challenging situation for us as a country. So it has been intense strategic importance to us. That's led to the whole state is covered with some oddities. This is about 30-minute hike from my parents' house. This is a decommissioned Cold War site for the Nike missiles that were intended to shoot down Russian missiles over the Pacific. There are conspiracies abound, much like West Virginians. Alaskans hold some interesting views about different government sites. This one is a high altitude radar that some people believe changes the weather. This is another interesting radar array that people think the government's listening to them. I would say probably the government might be listening to you. And this is a more recent development. This was in the second Bush administration. He pursued, during buildup of North Korea's capabilities, he pursued a new interceptor missile system. This guy is not super close to me, but he was a family friend around the time when I was finishing high school and thinking about what I wanted to do with my life. His name's Ricky Ellison. He was a starting middle linebacker for the San Francisco 49ers during the Montana Super Bowls. And he became a friend of my dad's because he was traveling to Alaska to basically advocate for missile defense systems. And I had never met someone with a Super Bowl ring, and he had 3, so I thought he was the coolest guy I'd ever met. So I listened to every word he said and was really interested in kind of the history of the Cold War and Alaska's place in it. It just seemed like something I wanted to pursue. So I was searching for things to do with my life. When looking back at photos of my, for this talk, I found myself posing like this a lot of times in my teenage years. So looking for what I wanted to do. It took me to San Diego, where I ran track, and I studied, like Dr. Dia said, history. I focused on 20th century conflicts and economics. I focused on game theory, which is basically a math expression of decision making, and thinking that I would pursue some sort of career in defense or in the State Department. Probably in order of where I spent my time was the beach, the library, and then track was very secondary to what I was doing there. But probably the height of my interest to this, I spent a semester in the Czech Republic studying the transition from the Cold War to our current state. This is me in Wenceslas Square. This is the Velvet Revolution of the Czechoslovakia, where it was a peaceful transition from communist rule in 1989. After this, I went and did an internship in DC and became pretty disillusioned with the whole thing, and had to reconsider my track. And I'll leave that part of the story out, but pursuing medicine instead of this, but always has been an interest of mine. All right, to the hard stuff, to the bad news. The development of atomic theory kind of originates in the early 1800s. John Dalton described the atom first. He never proved it, but he came up with the first model of an indivisible particle. It wasn't until the late 1800s with Marie Curie, a Polish woman who was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize and then won it again, discovering radioactivity. and then Ernest Rutherford describing the nucleus as well as nuclear decay, showing that there are, different particles and subparticles that can be expressed off of an individual atom. And then what brings us to our the meat of our topic is this is a Hungarian Jew named Leo Szilard. He escaped Nazi Germany and then first described nuclear chain reaction and critical mass, basically that you could use these principles of nuclear decay in order to cause an extreme and violent reaction. This was recognized, I think we've grown accustomed to every year a different blockbuster hit comes out of, the end of the world, a bomb explodes or the guy saves the day at the last second. But the first description by A.G. Wells, he wrote The Time Machine and he wrote War of the Worlds, but he also wrote this. It was like looking down the crater of a small volcano, the open garden before the imperial castle. A shuddering star of evil splendor spurted and poured smoke and flame towards them like an accusation. They were too high to distinguish the people clearly or mark the bomb's effect on the building until suddenly the facade tottered and crumbled before the flare as sugar dissolved in water. The man stared for a moment, showed all his long teeth, and then staggered into a cramped standing position his straps permitted, hoisted out another bomb, and sent it down after his fellow. This encapsulates kind of the time. This is, in World War, around the era of World War I, where, there's more and more technology is developing. People are experiencing warfare in a new way. In his writings, Winston Churchill talks about reading that book and looking further into the topic. He said, "Might not a bomb no bigger than an orange be found to possess a secret power to destroy a whole block of buildings, nay, to concentrate the force of 1,000 tons of cordite and blast a township at a stroke?" I don't think he knew what was coming next in 1924. I put this slide in here basically to demonstrate and to give some of the context of the development of these weapons, so we can really grapple with what people were facing at this time. I think this picture, I think most of us, I hope all of us can agree, is the most disgusting political expression of the last 100 years. And it led the world into a fever pitch towards potentially its own destruction. These two scientists notably discovered nuclear fission in 1938. This is after Nazi Germany had already started its invasions and acquisitions of other countries. Basically what they discovered was the first block of this, that you could bombard a particle or an atom of uranium with a particle, and you could get it to split and release a lot of energy. What they propose is that some of the particles also given off by this reaction could then give off a chain reaction, but this yet was not demonstrated. A year later, Hitler introduced the Nazi urine project. This sinister looking guy is Werner Heisenberg. He says, "We must make use of physics for warfare." They design a bomb on paper. They have all of the uranium known to man, maybe 90% of it, either from the Czech Republic or from Belgium. And then the director of the program, Kurt Deinber. The four of these people in the West were started to be viewed as the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And Einstein and Szilard, who we talked about earlier, wrote a letter to FDR. I won't read this in its entirety, but they basically described the possibility of a weapon being developed from this new technology. And they urged the president to look into this further and to appoint someone that he trusts to basically start an investigation and research on if this is feasible, can the weapon be created. Not long after this, we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, and the country, began pursuing all of its resources in total war against Japan and Germany. The people that he picked, FDR picked to run this project were Robert Oppenheimer and Leslie Groves. He was a general in the Army, and their project was called the Manhattan Project. I don't think it's a surprise to any of you that I was Team Oppenheimer over Team Barbie when the movies came out. They basically took on one of the largest projects in human history. It employed at its peak over 200,000 people, but over 500,000 individuals across 12 states were involved. Most important sites were getting uranium and plutonium in Tennessee and Washington, and then it was headquartered in New Mexico, where they developed the bomb. They developed the delivery systems. Their first major breakthrough was actually to demonstrate sustained fission in Chicago. This was done in a secret laboratory underneath the tennis courts at the University of Chicago. They used a large containment of graphite and were able to achieve sustained nuclear fission using uranium. And then not long after that, they assembled two different types of devices. One was a gun type assembly method that would shoot particles into uranium, and then an implosion device that would basically create extreme pressure around a plutonium core to induce an explosion. This is the gadget. This was the first tested device. This was a plutonium device, and this was exploded on July 16th, 1945 in the Trinity test. Marked our entry into the atomic era. News soon spread to President Truman. At this point, Nazi Germany had already been defeated, and he was meeting in Potsdam this week of the test to meet with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin to determine how Europe was going to be divided between the nations, and then also how to deal with Japan, who was still actively fighting in the East. He revealed to his allies that a bomb of this magnitude had been invented, and that it was, and that he intended to potentially use it on Japan. In his speech to the conference, he warns Japan. He calls the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of the Japanese forces and provide proper and adequate assurances of good faith in such action. The alternative is prompt and utter destruction. Now, there was a series of bombings that were occurring at this time, so the islands of Japan were under heavy bombardment, but he never disclosed to them that there was a new, more powerful invention. This was Japan's response. Mokusatu simply means withholding comment. Japanese culture, we have to understand. I'll just briefly go into it. I'm no expert in it, but basically from the time of the late 1800s to the 1940s, they went from a feudal system, basically with no centralized government, to a modern state. They held on in this very quick transformation. Some of their beliefs and their ideals called Bushido, which is what we call the way of the samurai. And it's a highly aggressive, violent form of feudalism, and can partially explain why we saw such things as kamikaze pilots and banzai charges during the war in the Pacific. The US, prior to the development of the bomb, had planned a invasion of Japan. This was probably going to be 5 to 6 times larger than the D-Day invasions. And needless to say, the estimated casualties were horrendous. Some estimates put US soldier deaths at 1 million in order to take the islands of Japan. Their entire economy and society revolved around supporting the war effort. They trained over 30 million civilians in use of hand-to-hand combat, and it was the experiences in Okinawa that showed the US leadership that an invasion would be astronomical in terms of civilian and combat losses. With this information, President Truman made the decision this was about 2 weeks after the Potsdam conference, to load the first atomic bomb called the Little Boy onto the Enola Gay. It took off August 6, 1945 from Guam. The next part of this talk, it includes a clip from Dr. Oppenheimer, describing the entry into the atomic era. I debated whether or not to include it, but I think in order to fully evaluate this topic, we have to kind of confront what this wrought on the Japanese people.
He knew the world would not be the same.
Sorry.
Few people laughed.
I don't know if you can hear this.
People cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that.
So most violent acts at the end of basically a 10-year conflict. This was a, I want to, it released an explosion that destroyed the city, essentially killing all its inhabitants. It had no discrimination between military targets or civilians. Again, Truman and the United States gave an ultimatum to the Japanese to surrender. 2 days later, the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria and the Korean Peninsula and threatened a second invasion from the north. And then a day following that, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Between the two events, 250,000 people were thought to have killed by the end of the year. This is a Japanese doctor, Shintaro Hida. He cared for over 10,000 survivors during his career. He was a young military doctor at the time of the bombing. He said the cruelest aspect of the attack is not the destruction of the human bodies or the burns, but its life-destroying after effects. One day after the bombing of Nagasaki, the Emperor of Japan capitulated and surrendered. Now, during this buildup, there was already increasing tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. They were basically reluctant allies during the Second World War, and many thought that the war may even just continue after Hitler was defeated. They're not natural enemies. The US and Russia have never fought one another in history. We don't border each other, and we don't share particularly our history doesn't share like massive contradictions to one another. But the emergence of kind of these two poles of communism, of authoritarianism in the form of Stalin versus a capitalist society that we use in the West and in Europe have kind of brought this post-war situation to what we call the Cold War. Basically, it's a frozen stalemate between the two blocks that approximates the final front lines of the Second World War. Europe and the United States and Canada formed the NATO alliance in 1949, and the Soviets countered this with a Warsaw Pact in 1955. These were mutual defense pacts, basically saying an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us, it led to the development and the buildup of tensions between the two sides over the coming decades. It wasn't long after the end of the Second World War that the Soviets acquired their first atomic bomb. This is Klaus Fuchs. He was a member of the Manhattan Project and basically stole all of the documents and the designs of the bomb used at Hiroshima and brought them to the Soviets. And they tested this, basically a replica of our bomb, on August 29th, 1949. What then transpired was what we call this arms race, starting in the 1950s and 60s and peaking, depending on what nation we're looking at, in the late 60s for us, or at the end of the Cold War for the Soviets. Many other nations began experimenting and pursuing nuclear armaments as well, including the UK, France, and China. And that kind of comprised the 5 countries that had the bomb during the height of the Cold War. Albert Einstein says during this buildup, things were rapidly advancing so quick that he did not know what weapons were going to be used in a third World War, but he knew that if that came to be, that we would basically go to the Stone Age. This is Castle Bravo test. This was the largest bomb ever tested by the United States. It was a 15 megaton hydrogen fusion bomb, 1,000 times more powerful than the one used in Hiroshima. Not to be outdone, the Soviets tested Tsar Bomba 1961 in the Russian Arctic, a 50 megaton hydrogen fusion bomb that was over 3,000 times more powerful than the one used in Japan. And they had actually developments of a 100 megaton fusion bomb as well. If this wasn't scary enough, because during this time, these weapons would only be delivered by a plane. So you would have to fly, across oceans or across large distances, or shoot it just with regular artillery. The Sputnik moment, whilst, maybe in our modern lens, we look back at it as a great achievement of, space exploration. We were able to put a satellite into orbit. It was a terrible time for the United States, as it basically marked the implementation of intercontinental ballistic missiles. If you could put a satellite like this into orbit, could you put a nuclear bomb? And they demonstrated the capacity and the capability to be able to do this soon after. There was other developments in aeronautics. Basically, during the height of the Cold War, we had planes circling the Arctic, circling areas over the Pacific 24/7, basically getting constantly refueled and then switching out. This was a further development, was the implementation of a submarine-based missile. This probably is one of the greatest developments of the Cold War, in that it presented the greatest challenge, and the greatest fear is that you could secretly or covertly park a submarine just offshore of New York City or of London, and you would only have minutes of warning before destruction. The 3 of these represent what has been called the nuclear triad, using air, sea, and land. Our modern triad consists of 18 B-2 bombers, 18 Ohio-class submarines, and over 400 Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles. Those are housed in Wyoming, North Dakota, and Montana, and they're spread over such an array that to destroy one of them, you have to destroy it one at a time. So it's thought it would be like a sponge, so that it would draw all of the fire of the Soviets to try to take out each and every one of these missiles in rural, unpopulated areas. The 3 of these led to the emergence of what's called mutually assured destruction. This is a NATO doctrine employed by the USSR and by us, and it was coined by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. It emerges with the development of these technologies that ensures that if you were to strike your opponent first, that the opponent would be able to retaliate, and both nations would be destroyed by an outbreak of war. Just referencing back to my game theory, this is a situation called Nash equilibrium. This is by John Nash, basically creating a situation where both sides have no reason to change their strategy, so just locked in a constant stalemate. But anytime there's proliferation, anytime there's changes to technology, this equilibrium can be disrupted. This is just a basic demonstration of what game theory looks like in this situation. where every single time the players will always play to this bottom left corner because every single other possibility is destruction, and they represent it as a negative infinity. This is really a simplified form of it. The ones that, game theorists and military strategists use are whole webs of different possibilities and permutations. Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of our president, said, "In the nuclear age, superpowers make war like porcupines make love." These, now there's been dozens of close calls between the countries over the years. Usually it's a plane crashes or there's some sort of misarming of a device that leads to confusion. But these two represent the two closest times an exchange occurred. The first was in 1962 in the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States had put our land-based missiles in Turkey, and this was, thought to be in a red line that the Soviets had put in the ground. And their counter to this was to place similar arrangements in Cuba, which led to a multi-week crisis where we were at the highest level of preparedness for an attack. I include this officer, Vasily Arkhipov. He was a senior officer on a Russian submarine. His captain misinterpreted some depth charges that were being dropped by US ships as being the outset of war, and actually activated the missiles on their submarine. And he was the junior officer that overruled. In the situation, you needed both officers to confer an attack, and he's lauded a hero and one of the people who saved the day in the Cuban Missile Crisis. 20 years later, there was a war game that was taken on by the NATO alliance. Basically, these are military exercises that they carried out in Eastern Europe, and they were thought to be so realistic and so massive in scale that the Soviet command interpreted this as a real threat and put their bombs at highest alert. And during this operation, there was a false alarm that basically indicated to this colonel, Stanislav Petrov, that the US had fired their missiles. And he took the brave stance of interpreting this as a false alarm. He did not notify his superiors until after he had proven it. And it's thought that if he had raised this false alarm to the next level in his chain of command, that it could have sparked war. How this actually would play out it's not actually clear. During every scenario and war game and simulation of this, any use of a bomb has almost always resulted in full-on exchange. So there's no such thing as limited use or using them on a like on a military target only. Every time that military strategists or war gamers have tried to simulate what an exchange would look like, it involves a complete exchange between the countries. How it works differently for every country. The United States and Russia have a very top-down approach where the head of state is the sole person that can order the use of the bomb. President Trump will always be accompanied by an officer that's carrying what's called the nuclear football. This is the codes, the launch codes of our entire arsenal. He is required to meet with the cabinet and the Joint Chiefs of Staff before activating it, but experts have said this could be as brief as 30 seconds. Then it will go on to activate the weapons, and they will be fired. And this can all take place in less than 7 minutes. And once the weapons have been fired and initiated, they cannot be recalled or stopped. There's really only two options that our Constitution lays out that potentially could avert a poor actor in the presidency from using these, where the Secretary of Defense can overrule him. However, the president can just fire him on the spot and cite, emergency powers. And The other scenario is where they invoke the 25th Amendment of the Constitution, saying the president does not have the capacity to perform. Unclear whether or not the wrangling of this scenario could be achieved in this short time frame. I want to move on to maybe one of the heroes of this story is Bernard Lown. He is the inventor of the defibrillator. He introduced lidocaine as the treatment for arrhythmia. And if that wasn't enough, he started this organization called the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. And he surmised that the only prevention will cure this ailment. He wrote this landmark article in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1962. He traveled to Japan multiple times and met with the doctors who cared for the injured and the survivors, and wrote an authoritative piece about the effects of the bomb on the human body. The survivors are called hibakusha. In the initial stage, minutes to 9 weeks, 90% of the fatalities will be from burns or from blunt trauma, where 10% those are closest to the explosion will get a super lethal radiation poisoning, measured in grays, that lead to bone marrow death, loss the function of the GI tract, and central nervous system dysfunction. Delayed effects, in the immediate stage, in the few months afterwards, radioactive burns from fallout, pneumonitis, and sterility. And then in the latent phase, cataracts, most famously radioactive form of iodine-131 causing thyroid cancer. This is a father and a son who lived near Chernobyl, as well as perinatal effects. Not to mention, I don't go into this, but the whole sequelae of this, of infectious disease, famine, nuclear winter. He also, in his papers, to basically bring it home to the American public, described what a potential attack would look like on our homeland. This is from his paper in the New England Journal, looking at potential targets, and he was a professor at Harvard, so he chose his home city as ground zero, basically. These are really sobering statistics. He estimated that just in Massachusetts, that you would have, in a full nuclear exchange, 2.8 million fatalities and over a million casualties. At the same time, all of the hospital infrastructure, the physicians would be lost. The hospital infrastructure would be cut to slim margins. So you estimate that you'd care for nearly 1 million survivors with 2,000 hospital beds. So he took on this task of educating the public and educating our leaders about, the devastation of what this could look like. He says, we physicians have focused on the nuclear threat as the single issue of our era. We are not indifferent to other human rights or hard-won civil liberties. But first, we must be able to bequeath to our children the most fundamental of all rights, which is the precondition of all others, the right to survival. And he heavily lobbied Congress and the executive for changes to the way we do this. This is all just right in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, so it was high on everyone's mind that we needed some sort of path forward to de-escalate the situation. This led the year following to a partial nuclear test ban treaty, banning all testing of the bomb above ground. So this drove, this was in a time after Castle Bravo, where there were islanders in the South Pacific who were coming down with illnesses a decade after that test. So it was accepted by both the Soviets and the US that testing of this type would no longer be performed. And most importantly, this is the most important development on non-proliferation, was the NPT in 1968, agreed upon by 190 out of 195 nations. it established that the 5 countries we've already talked about would keep their bombs, but the other 185 participants would not pursue the weapons. The 4 nations that did not sign it all went on to develop bombs: India, Pakistan, Israel, and the one nation that did sign and then dropped out was North Korea. So it kind of speaks, in almost over 50, 60 years of this being in place, the countries that agreed to do this have, for the most part, upheld their end of the bargain, and has prevented the spread further of these devices. In 1985, Dr. Lown and his group won the Nobel Peace Prize, and this is in his acceptance speech. We physicians who shepherd human life from birth to death have an imperative to resist with all our being the drift towards the brink. The threatened inhabitants of this fragile planet must speak out for those yet unborn, for posterity has no lobby with politicians. Soon after this, the Soviet Union, due to pressures from us, due to internal pressure and division, collapsed. This is Ronald Reagan at the Brandenburg Gate, tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev. Not long after this, the Soviet Union dissolved. And we entered a new era of understanding between the countries that the weapons needed to be disarmed, and we needed to reduce the chance of an exchange between the countries. The first George H.W. Bush and Gorbachev came to agree to these START treaties, which rapidly de-escalated the number of devices. There was a time period in the mid-90s when Russia seemed to be on a track to joining NATO, to full de-escalation. But unfortunately, internal politics in that country has put a new leader there that obviously has more aggressive aims than Gorbachev. In the Obama administration, we renewed some of these agreements, but unfortunately, Russia has now rescinded its agreement to the New START treaty. So this kind of goes back to the beginning of the talk, where there's more and more discussion about rising tensions between countries. There's a number of hot spots in the world that we're worried about, whether or not the Iranians will develop a weapon, Russia's interest in getting Taiwan, Putin's incursions into Ukraine, this guy doing some soft power with Dennis Rodman, and the worry of the basically a hotspot for a potential second wave of proliferation between Iran and Saudi Arabia. If one country was to get the device, the other would rapidly be able to achieve parity. There's been more proliferation since that treaty. I alluded to these 4 nations that have now had the weapons. The only country ever to fully disarm was the apartheid South Africa. They secretly had developed about a dozen missiles in the early 70s, and then without telling the world that they ever had them, also got rid of them without telling the world until they did sign into the NPT agreement. So the story of that regime probably lies in some of the problems in disarmament. A nuclear-armed Korea sees that regime collapsed after they gave up the weapons on their own. So what's our path forward? That organization that Dr. Lown introduced still is active. It still pushes and tries to implement policies across the globe for disarmament. They know that this is going to be a multi-decade, if not a 100-year political problem that we'll have to face. But in the short term, they propose just 3 solutions that they encourage all of the nuclear states to employ, is to publicly say that they will never use the weapon first, to take nuclear weapons off this trigger alert where, in 7 minutes, Armageddon could be unleashed, and that all states that are currently at war will pledge publicly to never use the weapons in those conflicts. In 2017, the UN actually passed a resolution on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Now, this is a toothless development, but about 100 nations have signed on to this. And it prohibits across most of the landmass of the world the development, testing, production of these weapons. Obviously, none of the countries that have the weapons have signed on to this. That would mean rapid de-escalation and disarmament, and not a situation that these countries can pursue right now, but it does create a path forward for what a nuclear-free world might look like in the future. I think this basically wraps the talk, but I think our role as doctors just to first be informed of this problem, that it is a global health problem, that we have to educate the public, especially in a time where it does seem that things are escalating between different countries. There are saber rattling. We're nowhere near we were in the 1950s and 60s, but if we're not careful and we're not proactive, it certainly could escalate very rapidly between the countries. They're still active. They have an upcoming meeting this fall. I don't think I'll be able to make it to Nagasaki during my fellowship, but I look forward to. These are just some of the heroes of this story, and I'll take any questions at this time. Thank you. Thank you.